Today on Credit Authority with Rhonda Klch. Rhonda's talking all things cannabis business with Ed Foy, partner at Grousseau & Foy. Ladies and gentlemen, here's your host, Rhonda Klch.
Good morning, and thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of the Credit Authority. I'm so excited to be in studio today with a longtime friend of mine, attorney Ed Foy. So good morning to you.
Good morning, Rhonda. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, so I'm actually bringing you in here today not to discuss your legal background, but you are now one of the co-founders to Cannabis Licensing LLC.
Absolutely, and I'm so excited to be talking about my company and what we're here to do. So, company Cannabis Licensing LLC is a licensing service, but it's also a compliance and consulting service as well. And we're super excited to be talking to anyone in the space about what we do and how we can help.
So, am I mistaken? I want to make sure for the people that are listening, you're specifically licensing the state of New York.
Correct. Yeah, we're launching our New York product. We're boarding clients right now, and we're prepping for the application process. But as I tell everyone, the application process is actually quite a bit down the road from where you really need to go. For the first part, you have to start with the business model. You have to really make sure you have your company summary, you have all of your ducks in a row, because in order to fill out that application, you're going to need portions of your business plan that you really need to have on paper to begin with.
So let's back it up a little bit, because I'm going to keep you all show, right? Like normally I bring in multiple guests. Today it's all about you and
Great.
Talking about this, I almost want to say controversial topic. And it's not normally a comfort space of mine, but I feel like it's really necessary because it's just where not just our state, but other states are progressing, obviously for the dollars and the cents and everything else. So let's start with your background. So I know you as an attorney. So tell us a little bit about your background and how your background is allowing you to step from one space into another.
Sure. So, when I graduated from New York Law School, and I went right into the mortgage bank licensing compliance. So I was basically offering or applying for bank licenses throughout the state of New York. So essentially, throughout the country. Basically, when the financial recession occurred, because of defaulted mortgage products, the federal government stepped in and started offering licenses with a bit of a skeptical eye for mortgage banks. And so it was my job to jump into an FHA-assured bank, ICG, and to apply for both state branch licensing as well as the bank licensing as well. So I think we started at around 13, and by the time that I had left, we were at around 40 or so. So I think by the time I had left, they were really where they wanted to be. I left that and went into litigation, and since then I've been performing quite a bit of appellate and Supreme Court litigation, but my background was primarily in mortgage bank licensing.
So licensing for the mortgage industry obviously requires a lot of compliance. And from what I've read so far, and for what I know so far pertaining to this industry, the cannabis licensing also will have a lot of compliance. How have you been preparing yourself so that you can make that transition and be prepared for your clients?
Sure. So, the biggest focus is going to be first on making sure that we are putting together a business plan. It's the most important part. Every part of the actual application is going to be about who you are, who your company is, and what you're bringing to the table. I can't reemphasize this enough, is that New York specifically also has built out a huge part that's going to be social equity applicants, which we'll talk at a later point. But if you can structure yourself as one, it's really going to kind of change the ballpark. So making sure we have that business model laid out, which what you're going to be putting on paper is going to be your organizational plan, your security plan, but also your company summary and other relevant topics as well. But to answer the question is that we are going to be building out a business plan for you so that you can be ready from as soon as those applications hit, that we're going to be filling them out and getting them ready.
Would a consumer who's looking to apply for a license in the cannabis industry, are they allowed to independently file and you're adding a level of expertise, or is it required for them to have legal counsel to help, to do that application?
There's no requirement to date that would require that. I don't believe there will be. But no, we're simply here as consultants and we're here to add value. So, do you need to use us? No, but should you? Absolutely. The fact is that you are going to be jumping into one of the most regulated industries in America. And and if you want to jump into that on your own, just understand that you're biting off quite a bit there. And this is just going to be an area that if you're ever going to look for help, it's going to be in the cannabis industry, especially if you're starting off.
And of course, getting started early and setting up your plan the right way up front will save you time and money down the road, which is really essentially what you're striving to do with your clientele.
Absolutely. The perfect example of saving money, not making mistakes is, and we'll talk about social equity applicants, but if you're not going to be structured as a social equity applicant, you may need to jump into commercial space before you submit your application. And that application might, in fact, take 6 months to 10 months to be approved. So, 6 to 10 months down the road and you're paying for commercial property that you haven't really made $1 off yet, and now you get a denial, or you get maybe some sort of inquiry as to clarification on a point, and now you're set back another 60 days. This translates into thousands and thousands of dollars.
So somebody who's getting into the industry right now, it's, as much as, again, we use the word controversial, if somebody's not financially ready and responsible, they could be out of the game before they even start.
Sure. One of the selection criteria, which we'll get into as well, is going to make sure that not only they're going to want to know who you are and what your background is to make sure that you know what you're doing, but also that you have the capacity to perform the actions that you're being licensed for. So, if you don't have the infrastructure, or you don't have a financial plan for how you're going to get that, if you're handed a processing license to actually process cannabis, but you don't have either the equipment or the means to get the equipment, you're not going to do much processing.
Which makes sense, right? I get that.
And you won't be approved.
So in essence, somebody who's looking to get into the industry really needs to know ahead of time their plan, their budget, and it sounds like, most of all, even their timeline, because applying today does not give you permission today, right? There are licenses that exist whereby you apply for the license, 30 to 45 days later, you have a result and your business is operational.
Sure.
From the sounds of it, you need to really get yourself in the game now, position yourself, know where you want to be within the industry, and structure accordingly.
Yeah. And it's difficult right now because there are opt-out provisions that are still, towns, municipalities, and cities have the ability to opt out of certain licenses up until the end of this year. They have to pass a local law. Even if they passed one in the past, it's irrelevant. They have to pass one in 2021. So we're going to be looking for that come January 1. Okay, who's in, who's out, and where can we build? Perfect example is some of the licenses are going to require you to be 500 feet away from school grounds, as defined by New York State educational law. But we expect that they're going to expand upon that. It's not just
which honestly, you're a dad, I'm a mom. For as safe and effective cannabis can be for treating a lot of illnesses, and I look at it that way, it still doesn't mean that it's appropriate to be within a certain amount of distance from a child's school grounds.
And is similar for breweries and for alcohol as well as for tobacco. And these are things that we're going to have to prove on our application that we're going to be outstanding citizens of the community. It's going to be so important to show ourselves in that capacity, both to get licensed and to maintain licensing.
So now if somebody was interested in learning more about the industry, they're not really sure if this is a pathway for them, what are you doing now to help discuss and bring forward, and that's really how I'm looking at it, like how do you bring to light what is to be expected?
Sure. So, the most important thing I could say is you need to talk about first, who are you? What are your interests? What's motivating your interest in this industry? Some people will come to me and they say, I want to open up a dispensary, which is a retail license. Okay, great. Tell me about, what you're interested in. And the more that you're hearing is that you're realizing that this person actually has an interest and some experience with growing. And, dispensary is really not the area that we want to go in. In fact, there are these other licenses that are really going to better fit your interests, as well as, and it's actually something that's probably going to be a little more lucrative as well. So really laying down exactly who you are, where your interests are, and talking about what type of capital you're really going to need to bring to the table. So what do you have now, and what can we expect to get from financing to get you to this goal of opening your doors with a license?
So we're going to get ready to hit a commercial break. If somebody wants to get in touch with you, how do they reach you?
So I would say visit us on cannabislicensing.com. All right, you're going to find a ton of information there. You're going to find our locations, you're going to find our contact information, and you're really going to have, I really hope that you're going to find quite a bit of information about what you need. But by all means, give us a call.
Awesome. So stay put, because I have you scheduled for the entire show.
I'm great. I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
And welcome back to the Credit Authority. I am in studio today with Ed Foy. Not only is he an amazing attorney for the state of New York, but he is also one of the managing partners of Cannabis Licensing LLC. So Ed, thank you so much for joining with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So I know cannabis, huge controversial topic, but I want to stick to a few things that I think people in the state of New York may not necessarily recognize. Cannabis is a huge industry, and I know that there are regulations and then there are licensing. So I am going to rely on you to educate me about what's happening today in the state of New York with the licensing regulations, and also in reference to how they're planning on taxing us.
Sure. So let's jump right into it. So New York, in March 31st, 2021, passed the Mortgage Regulation and Taxation Act, acronym I refer to as MRTA. And what that did was a number of things on social justice reform, but more relevant to our discussion here is it created both a regulatory framework with 9 licenses, specifically a nursery license, cultivation license, a processing license, a delivery license, distribution license, a retail license, small business cooperative license, a on-site consumption license, and the last and final is the micro business license, which I'm really excited about.
And I'm listening to you rattle this, and just to be able to roll that off your tongue is amazing. So I'm a little stuck. So let's start with one license at a time.
Sure.
What that represents. So if somebody's listening or they're watching us on our video and they go, hey, cannabis looks like a cool industry, what are they in store for these different licenses?
Sure. So, one of the defining features of MRTA is that New York really compartmentalized the industry into these licenses, and to a point where if you have 1 or 2 licenses, you're actually prohibited from having others. And it's going to be a lot of, discipline that everyone's going to have to show as licensees in New York. So, let's start at the beginning, right? Let's start at agricultural, which is going to be your nursery license and your cultivation license. The most important part we have to understand is that the regulation that was passed was a framework. So although, yes, they created the 9 licenses, they also created a regulatory authority that is itself going to pass a number of regulations to fill in that framework. So from cultivation. Cultivation is going to be your big business license. It's going to be quite expensive to jump into it, and keep in mind you're only entitled to 1 licensed premises. And because the entire industry is only going to be able to operate off of the actual agriculture that's produced in New York, because you can't cross state lines, New York's going to be relying on the cultivators and the micro business and the small business cooperatives to grow the product so that we can process and sell. So with an actual cultivation license, you're entitled to own, possess, cultivate. You're able to cut, dry, trim, and cure the actual product. New York has come out with some information that there's going to be some processing, minimal amount of processing we're allowed to do without having the processing license. So we're going to be, kind of waiting on bated breath to see how much we can do with the cultivator's license, but we'll see.
So if I'm understanding correctly, and I'm trying not to laugh here, all of our home growers would be cultivators. Are they allowed to then sell to the public with that license as well, or is that where it stops?
And that's a great point, and that is where it stops. So the only licensees that are going to be allowed to sell to the public are going to be your retail, which is your dispensaries, and your on-site consumption. Nobody else gets to sell to the public. That's it. So for the most part, if you're interested in growing, just understand that you're going to be, growing your product and you're going to be selling it to a licensed vendor. The only point of sale to the public are going to be those 2 licenses.
And you just hit a great point, a licensed vendor. So dispensaries right now do exist in New York. If the licensing just came out, where are they getting their product from if we can't cross state line?
Well, the dispensaries that are up and running in New York are medical. So there's been no adult use that's been passed yet. And so, but it's going to be quite an interesting, there might be a bit of backlog, right? If I get my retail license before there's a cultivation license or a micro business license or a small business co-op, I have to wait around for those products to be ready because I'm not going to be able to get anything anywhere else. I certainly am going to need to make sure where I'm getting the product, and New York is going to know everything about who sold me the product, how many products that I have, and they're going to know everything about my inventory as well. And we're going to get into that a bit as well.
So what we're calling this would be highly regulated. So if a agricultural cultivator sold X amount of product to somebody at a dispensary, everything's logged from start to finish.
That's a perfect example is now, so we take the cultivator, right? The cultivator is going to grow. May or may not require some processing. So maybe that, now as a cultivator, you can have a nursery license, which allows you to possess seeds, to grow it to an immature plant. That's going to be your nursery. And then you can also you can have a delivery license, as I understand, but I'm going to look to the regs to see if that's going to be reinforced, as well as a processing license. So you'll be able to have up to 3 of those. But the next step is actually handing it over to the distributor, and that's going to be effectively your trucking, right? You're going to be picking it up from either the cultivator or the processor, and now they're going to be distributing it over to the on-site consumption and the retail. They're also going to probably be picking up from the micro business and the small business co-op, and so that's really now the distributor is going to be recording everything they're picking up from you and everything they're dropping off. And so the New York State is going to have that information, and they're going to have that information when you get audited, so they're going to know what your inventory should be if they're structured in a way to understand that.
So we know that, you and I, we live on Long Island, which I look at as non-agricultural, although we do have, our farms out east.
Sure.
But New York State in itself is relatively large. So how are you planning on getting your messaging out, and how do you think the industry is planning on getting the messaging out to all of New York State, not just regional?
Sure. COVID, we have to also acknowledge that we are operating business in COVID times right now, and it's difficult because the natural tendency is that we're going to be doing this in conventions, we're going to be doing this with networking, and we are going to be doing that for the most part, and so that's pretty much for the most part how we're going to be reaching out. There's going to be a lot of marketing and advertising that we're going to be doing, and what's interesting enough is we're going to be providing guidance on appropriate marketing and guidance for licensees that are looking to advertise their product, because there's going to be a lot of regulation about what you can and can't say.
Which would make sense. It goes back to your experience in the mortgage industry.
Sure.
Right? There are certain things that you can and cannot represent,
right,
which would make sense. So, okay, so let's go back to the licensing.
Sure.
Tell me what other licenses, or where you think the challenges are going to be with licensing.
So, we can start with cultivation. Cultivation is going to be quite expensive, and because you're limited to 1 license, you need to kind of go quite big if you can. And you want to make sure that you're doing it responsibly, but that's it, you have 1 premises. And then for the most part, you can build out some processing, you can have up to 3 processing locations, so that you can kind of build up. Maybe you're going in kind of at a moderate size for processing, and then maybe you say, okay, the next step, what do I need? Do I need to go bigger? Can I go a little bit smaller? But with cultivation, you're going to have to really kind of, reach a bit if possible. Once again, so some of the tougher things I'd say is when you're dealing with, let's say, retail. It's going to be a great example, or distribution. Retail, and specifically, you are effectively on an island. Not only can you not have any sort of a license in any other area within the industry, you can't have a relationship, direct or indirect, with someone that has a license in another area. And we're going to really lean on the regulations as they come out to really understand the scope of those limitations, but they seem to be quite broad from the regulatory framework under MRTA. So what does that mean? That means that you're not going to be able to sign exclusive deals, to just actually shelve one person's product or another. You're not going to be able to receive gifts or things of value that could otherwise persuade you to put your products on shelves. Well, that's going to actually, that's quite a bit. It's almost as if you're effectively a politician of sorts, and there's the lobbying rules where you have to be careful about what things of value you're actually pocketing. So there's going to be quite a bit of discipline that retail licensees are going to need to be able to maintain. It's going to be quite interesting how it plays out.
I am looking forward to seeing how this plays out. And again, I'm keeping you all show today, so we do have to break for a quick commercial. Again, I am with Ed Foy, attorney and managing partner for Cannabis Licensing LLC. Stay tuned for a quick commercial break. Welcome back to another episode of The Credit Authority. I am in studio today with attorney Ed Foy, who also happens to be the managing partner of Cannabis Licensing LLC. And I am so excited to have you because you've been on so far, my entire show. And what's exciting to me is just listening to all of the regulations that are involved in the cannabis industry. So we've spoken already about your background, your introduction. You just blew me away with the 9 different licensing regulations. But what I want to jump into now is the social equity aspect of the industry, and if you could really explain what that means. So again, for the people that are watching or listening, they have a better understanding of what's to come next and how social equity, could really affect their business and the way that they operate.
Absolutely. This is actually something that New York has built out the social equity applicant portion of adult use in a way that no other state that's passed. Previously they referred to it as recreational use, but it's built it out in a way that no other state really has. So first off, the legislation that was passed is the Mortgage Regulation and Taxation Act. It was passed March 31st, 2021. And what that did was it created 9 licenses, and then also created a regulatory authority, which MRTA tasks to award 50% of the licenses to social equity applicants.
Explain for those people that may not understand what that means.
Sure. So, look, the idea is that, if you can qualify as a social equity applicant, you're going to be prioritized in the application process. And if you don't qualify, you may or may not have 50% of the licenses still available to you. So let's talk about what a social equity applicant is. It's quite broad. So for the most part, social equity applicants are any entity that is owned with at least 51% ownership, whether that be female ownership, whether that by minority ownership, or whether that by service-disabled veterans or impoverished farmers. And so we can talk a bit about what these differences are going to be. As far as minority, for the most part, I think it pretty much is including, I want to say it is Central and South America, the vast majority of the islands, I believe India as well as Asia, and African that is of the black racial group. And so, Egypt is going to be a good example of someone that may not actually qualify as a social equity applicant. And so, right off the bat, people are going to say, okay, well, what are the benefits with being a social, equity applicant? And it is quite broad. I always like to remind people, you don't need to qualify. If you really feel that you're bringing a product to the table and you're not sure if you need to partner up to qualify under this, what are the costs associated that I'm going to incur if I'm not? Because I understand if I'm giving away a certain percentage of my business, is it worth it? And
sure.
And so that's really what we're here to kind of talk about. So for the most part, when we think that there's only 50% of the licenses available, well, when you really look at the New York State, Census Bureau information, for the most part, Caucasians make up about 69.4% of the population, females about 51.6% of the population, and then when you take out of the remaining number, so we're starting at around 33% of the population, are still going to fit into about 50% of the licenses.
So if I'm understanding correctly, if somebody, New York State has X amount of licenses to give, but if you are approved as a social equity applicant, there's a higher probability that your license will be approved.
Certainly going to be prioritized.
If somebody, for example, if I'm understanding this correctly, is applying, so John Smith is applying for a license, can Jane Smith, his wife, be the minority partner and qualify for social equity?
So New York, in their legislation, makes clear, first of all, in order to qualify, they have to be a 51% owner, so they have to be the majority partner. But in the legislation, they make clear that it has to be a real partner, that they have to be involved in the actual day-to-day. And you know what, when you're getting audited and they're taking a look at what you're doing, they're gonna look for that. And if they find that, that they don't think or they don't feel confident that this is an active majority owner, you're gonna run the risk that if you were approved, that you're gonna get a revoked license. And, and that's something that you've spent a whole lot of money and time and investment getting into. So you just need to make sure that absolutely, you can absolutely bring in a 51% owner, just make sure that they're active.
So now let's just take a social equity applicant and they do move forward, they do get their license approved. What other benefits are there to somebody that qualifies for that license?
Yeah, great question. And we're going to learn more about this as we go down. But right off the bat, from what we see from the Mortgage Regulation and Taxation Act is that when we're looking at the selection criteria for qualifying, it seems to, and this is something that's going to be reinforced when the regulations hopefully come out in January, that you may not actually have to have and control a commercial property on or before the time that you apply for the application. So what does that mean? That means that if you're not qualifying as a social equity applicant, you may actually have to take on a commercial space and then apply for a license that may or may not take 6 to 10 months to really be approved. And so now, let's say we're jumping in, let's call it a dispensary for instance. On average, they're around about 2,500 square feet to 5,000 square feet. So, what are we jumping into as far as cost? We're saying, let's call it somewhere between around $4,000 to $7,000 a month, give or take. And that obviously can go up. So if you're 6 months down the road, or 10 months down the road, you're really looking on the low end at least $24,000 to $40,000, and that's just hard rent. That's not even the different insurance products, the different expenses you're just going to have from securing that premises. Right off the bat, your upfront costs are going to be somewhere in the ballpark of around $40,000 to $70,000 that you otherwise may not incur if you could qualify as a social equity applicant.
Understood.
Further, in addition to that, we're seeing that social equity applicants are going to potentially be entitled to low or no cost loans. And so this is going to be incredibly important. And the second and final, from what I can see from the legislation, is that one of the aspects of the actual application you're going to have to fill out is going to be either how you are going to contribute to communities that have been disproportionately impacted by cannabis regulation. But it doesn't seem that you will necessarily need to do that if you're a social equity applicant. And what that really breaks down to is diverting a percentage, maybe a point or two of revenue on a constant basis out to community causes, which you may want to do anyway.
So it's pushing you to be a little philanthropic.
Absolutely. And there's nothing stopping you from doing it as a social equity applicant.
And not being looked at or viewed as it being anything other than what it is, putting money back into your community. So in reference to the application process, and I know we've touched on this, and you just mentioned something important, which is about funding. And we're calculating and we're budgeting and you're going through all of these things. Is it New York State that will be providing these funding options, lending institutions, or do you think it will be the SBA? Has there been any speaking about who will actually help produce the loans that the industry? Because I know that I've spoken to bankers knowing you were coming on, and I asked, and it seems like it's still shunned.
Sure. So, you have to understand that, although that the New York State has legalized adult use, it is still and remains, federally illegal under the Secure Substances Act, under the federal government, still Schedule I. So because of that, you're not going to find any sort of cooperation on the federal government side. And, hopefully with time that's going to change. But until then, we need to operate and understand that only social equity applicants, from my understanding of how the Mortgage Regulation Taxation Act was passed, are going to have the benefit of New York State loans, low to no interest loans. Otherwise, non-social equity applicants are going to have to look for private financing, which is something that we are going to be helping you out with.
So somebody gets on board working with cannabis licensing. Part of your consulting package would be that you will have a portfolio of services and providers that could really assist the person that's looking to get involved in the cannabis industry.
Absolutely. In order for us to even start filling out an application, you need to know what is your commercial space going to look like? How are you going to improve the premises in a way that's both going to help the operation and the flow of traffic in and out of the premises, as well as your physical security plan. And all of that is going to deal with construction, and it's going to deal with, so you need your commercial property, you need your actual, your intellectual property and your standard operating practices all in place in order for us to even present how your company is going to operate. And so all of this is going to have to be worked out in a business plan. And and these are sections of a business plan. There are sections that do you need to have before you start a business? You should have it. That's just the best way that I could say it.
Business person plans ahead.
Right. And so I guess that's the best way that I could answer that question.
Which I love. So obviously, for the sake of time, we are going to pause for a commercial break. Again, you are watching The Credit Authority. I am your host, Rhonda Klch, and we have in studio today Ed Foy, attorney, as well as managing partner for Cannabis Licensing LLC. Stay tuned. Welcome back to The Credit Authority. I am your host, Rhonda Klch. And on today's episode, we are speaking all about the cannabis industry. So I have with me today a friend of mine, attorney Ed Foy, who's also the managing partner of Cannabis Licensing LLC. Welcome, Ed. How are you?
Well, thanks for having me today.
So I know for those that have been actually listening to us on the radio versus watching us on video, we've had you all segment long, right? Like the whole show. And I feel like we could do this all day long. So we're trying to break everything down into segments, right? So it's easy to listen to, easy to digest. So I want to say I saved the worst for last. I don't even know if that's the thing, because I want to talk about the selection and how does New York State determine who is going to get their license, and then of course, as a licensee, what should they expect and how do they actually prepare for the actual license itself?
Sure. I mean, this is going to be the hot button question because, this is what is going to separate those that are licensed and those that don't get licensed. So when we break right into, when New York State passed the Mortgage Regulation and Taxation Act of 2021, they built out a framework as well as putting in selection criteria so that it gives us some guidance as to what to kind of prepare for. And one of the distinguishing features, and I've said this before, I'll say it again, of New York's MRTA is that they have really emphasized the social equity applicant portion of it. So selection criteria, the very first thing that New York is talking about is whether or not you're a social equity applicant. And then from there, and if you're not, then they're going to want to know how you can actually benefit communities disproportionately impacted by cannabis regulation, which is going to amount to an actual business plan as to how you're either going to, these can be, I don't want to put anyone in a box as saying you have to structure it this way. If you have your own ideas of how you want to benefit these communities, which, just so that you understand, New York has not yet identified these communities yet. So we're waiting for the regulations to come out so that they can say, these are the communities that you need to benefit. So, what I'm giving guidance for is to say, look, there are a number of nonprofits that you can reach out to that deal with the reintroduction of inmates, and so these are things you could look at. But a common way of achieving this goal is to actually dedicate 1 to 2 points of revenue towards a particular goal. And so New York is understanding that as you grow, so does the community.
So give me an example of if I was selected as to receive a license,
Sure.
and it was a social equity license. How would I determine who I would want to be the beneficiary, or does New York State step in and determine that on my behalf?
No, this is something that you are submitting to New York State on your own, and this is something you're going to handle and manage. And from the legislation, it looks like if you are a social equity applicant, you may not need to include that strategy in your application, which really is going to make a bit of a difference in your revenue model. But I'll say this, so of course that's kind kind of your first selection criteria. But your very next is focusing on how can you maintain effective control against the illegal diversion of cannabis. And what does that mean, right? That means that you are running a secure facility that no one is going to, reasonably be able to break into at night, that you are running a responsible operation, that customers coming into are not going to find a way to pocket cannabis on the way out. But who's really going to get you are employees. So how your employees are also, you're going to structure both an operational plan and a security plan that will prohibit and deter employees from putting together strategies for pocketing cannabis as well. And that's going to be a real dollar sign. We're going to want to know that if we're a dispensary or if we're dealing with, anything of substance, that we're going to have a real vault, not just a safe, but a real vault that you may need to expand maybe in 3 years after operating. And so these are all parts of the actual layout plan, so that there's also room for growth on top of it. We go into other aspects as to making sure that you have sufficient land to perform the functions that you're looking for. Once again, back to social equity applicants, you may not actually have to actually be holding it at the time you're making the application. They're going to be looking for other things as far as who are you? Who is your team? Do you know what you're doing? Do you have the actual equipment to perform the tasks? We're going to be looking at background checks and making sure you don't have any financial interests in other licenses that you're not supposed to have interests in.
Okay.
They go specifically into making sure that you are fully compliant with all state and local municipality rules. And that's going to be another big thing. So, of course, municipalities on the town, city, and village level have an opportunity to opt out of either on-site consumption, which is going to be more of your coffee shops, as well as your dispensaries, which is your retail license. But they cannot actually opt out of anything else. So that doesn't stop the actual municipalities from still passing regulations that affect you. And what that means is they're allowed to still pass time, manner, and place regulation, which is going to talk about making sure that your location is not within certain points of interest. The New York basically says that if you're trying to bring out a retail license or an on-site consumption, you need to be 500 feet away from school grounds. Okay, but let's expect that we're going to expand on those, that it's going to be more than 500 feet,
Sure.
and we're going to include more than school grounds. We're going to have places of worship, we're going to have playgrounds, and we're going to have a whole lot more. So when we're submitting the application, we can show where we are and where all the points of interest are, among other things.
So it's also understanding the demographics of what community you're looking to go into.
Absolutely.
And then, so I'm assuming that this is where your law practice comes into play. You will be able to go from point A to point B and say to somebody, look, as regulations change, or as villages or municipalities change, as a law firm or somebody being a client of Cannabis Licensing LLC, you are one step ahead of and following what's happening on a regulatory basis with the state of New York, so that you're able to keep the business owner up to date.
Yeah,
and compliant.
Well, and that's the focus, is to make sure that we are doing what we need to so that you're not seeing the violation to begin with. Because, sure, when we get to the point that the town is coming in and they're hitting you with violations because they either didn't opt out and they wish they did, and now they're being a bit abusive, at some point we have to step out of the cannabis licensing product and we have to talk about, whether or not we need to go in a different direction. The point, of course, is to make sure that we're not there, right? That we know the communities that we're jumping into. We know what we need to do to be a good citizen of that area there. But make no mistake, there's going to be a number of attorneys that you're going to need to coordinate with. A perfect example is, for non-dispensaries and non-on-site consumption, but for people that are creating products, you're going to want to make sure that you have an intellectual property attorney on, retainer, so that you can create your branding, you can protect your intellectual property. And intellectual property is something that, at another time we're going to get further into to really talk about, because it's actually going to be something that can actually save you quite a bit of money.
When somebody is going through the licensing phase, we're all looking at the cannabis industry. We grew up, you and I are somewhat similar of age. We've grown up in a society where it was bad and it was shunned. And now we're seeing all the health benefits of cannabis, and, even people that are transitioning from hard drugs to, cannabis for medical purposes and pain management. These would be what we call, the positives about what we have, in the industry. Talk about a little bit about what you think the communities are going to say as these shops pop up.
So, this is something that absolutely comes up, where they say, look, you're going to be going and probably presenting in some capacity in these municipalities. And in these meetings and hearings, there's probably going to be 4 moms that are going to be showing up, that it doesn't matter what you say, they are going to be absolutely against what you're trying to do here. And that is where your community outreach, your networking is going to be so important. If, for instance, if I'm opening up a shop, for the most part, statistically, the property values go up. The traffic to other businesses goes up, and everyone makes more money. And when people understand this, they understand that a dispensary in their neighborhood can actually be a securing. A perfect example would be this, is that, I want to say there was a situation where I was talking with a police captain, and he was quite a bit against, the whole industry. But what he has come to learn over time is that because of the security that these institutions always generally have, there was a time when there was an issue with road rage that actually took place in front of this dispensary, which was in another state. And the first thing that the police officer realized was to go over to the dispensary and to say, hey, I know that you have cameras and you have great security. Do you have a shot of this? It happened on or around this point. When there are actual, instances where there's actual theft that goes on in the actual institution, which it'll happen, it happens everywhere. They're going to understand that there is going to be video, there is going to be a full documented report of every bit of evidence that they need to do their job, which is going to be emailed to them in a very nice and coordinated package. And so, these are examples of how we're going to be better, citizens for, the police. We're going to be better citizens for, the other people that own small businesses around our community. And, and if we're building out community outreach in a way that's benefiting these communities by just philanthropy, these are also great examples of how a rising ship.
So in other words, cannabis can actually bring communities together. It can create new relationships, new business opportunities. And I think the biggest takeaway is that for where we're going in our society, it's to keep our minds open. Right? So again, you are listening to The Credit Authority. I am your host, Rhonda Klch, and we have had nothing but an amazing experience with our guest today, Ed Foy, attorney, as well as managing partner for Cannabis LLC. Until next time, thank you so much for joining us.